Hello, everyone, and welcome to MillerKnoll Design Perspectives. We will start in a couple of minutes. We'll give the group a chance to log in. So welcome. Okay, super. Looks like we have 200 people and growing so far, and it's the top of the hour. So we're going to go ahead and officially get started. So welcome everyone to MillerKnoll Design Perspective Series. I'm Alan Almasy, and we have Amy Auscherman with us. Amy is the subject matter expert for today's presentation, and she is our Director of Brand Heritage and Archives. And Amy will be sharing with you our first MillerKnoll CEU entitled Leading Modernism, the Designers Who Forwarded the Movement. And this will range a broad array of designers who have collaborated with both Herman Miller and Knoll, starting with the Bauhaus in Europe and then coming to Cranbrook in the United States and on from there. So we certainly hope that you enjoy this presentation. This is, as I said, a CEU presentation. So when you registered for the event, you should have submitted all of your AIA and IDCEC credentials. And for everyone who is attending live, you will receive a CEU credit. Additionally, for people seeking IDCEC credit, there will be a barcode embedded in the presentation at the end that you can use as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Amy Auscherman. But first, one more thought. We will do Q&A at the end of this. So we ask that the audience holds their questions until the end, and then we'll just take a look at chat, which is where we ask you to post your questions, and then ask the questions to Amy. So Amy, over to you.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks everyone for joining virtually today. I'm going to go through the front matter for you all, which Alan went over. For IDCEC members, this course provides 0.1 CEU value. Attendees seeking credit with IDCEC must provide an IDCEC identification number. I think some more. I'll let you all read through this on your own. There will be a QR code at the end of this. So in this course, you all will learn about modernism's roots in the Bauhaus, the relationships of major mid-century designers, including Marcel Breuer, Harry Bertoia, Mies van der Rohe, Gilbert Rohde, Eliel and Eero Saarinen, Florence Knoll, Rohe and Charles Eames, George Nelson, Alexander Girard, all the greatest hits, and the influence these designers had on two companies at the center of modernism, Herman Miller and Knoll. I see I'm getting Evelyn and Alan. Can you all hear me? I just saw a comment in the chat that they hear static, so just want to make sure you guys can hear me.
I can hear you on my end.
Yes, I can hear you.
Cool. At the end of this course, participants will understand how modernism is rooted in the Bauhaus, appreciate the importance of interconnections between key mid-century modern designers to modernism in America, understand how these key designers shaped Herman Miller and Knoll's differing approaches to design, and recognize the degree to which the two companies and their designers shifted these tastes and preferences of design professionals and buying public towards modernism. So, welcome. Breuer, Saarinen, Florence, Gilbert, Ray and Charles, Harry Bertoia, Alexander Girard. The list of the designers who worked with Herman Miller and Knoll reads like a pantheon of design greats. And they were a mixture of colleagues, friends, and sources of inspiration for each other. They were also the sparks that ignited the flames of modernism in America. Today, we're going to take a closer look at the interconnections between these designers and the way they shaped the differing expression of modernism at Herman Miller and Knoll, two companies that sit at the center of mid-century modernism. So we're going to start with the Bauhaus. Before we get into the stories about the designers, it's helpful to have some context. Modernism is rooted in the Bauhaus, an art school founded in 1919 in Weimar, Germany by Walter Gropius, a German architect. His vision was for a craft guild that brought together the fine arts and craftsmanship in a cross-disciplinary way. Textiles, furniture, ceramics, painting, even household goods all had the potential to be both beautiful and useful. So at the Bauhaus, students learned about the principles of architecture, sculpture, and painting, in addition to crafts like metalworking and typography, so that they could create things both beautiful and useful. The Bauhaus also emphasized the importance of designing for mass production and adopting the slogan of art into industry. So I love these images that represent that, the one in the middle in particular being from a Bauhaus ballet that was done. So students were not only doing the choreography, but also designing these amazing costumes as well, which you can see on YouTube if you want to check it out after the presentation. Mies van der Rohe was the last director of the Bauhaus, which closed in 1933. During the years leading up to World War II, he and other key figures in the Bauhaus moved to the US and brought the school's design philosophy of beauty and functionality with them. Van der Rohe taught at what would become IIT, where one of his students was Florence Schust, who was later Knoll. Studying under Mies, who became a good friend, was pivotal for Florence. She said Mies was the person who most influenced her design philosophy, and a decade or so later, he would grant Knoll exclusive rights to produce his furniture, including the Barcelona collection pictured here, the Bruno chair, and the MR series. MR series, which is pictured here, was made with tubular steel and a cantilever bottom. There's also some Bruno chairs in the back. A really great Mies quote. Mies' designs were sleek, highly engineered, and incorporated new materials. These designs married traditional-looking upholstery with steel in a way that was new at the time. Everything, the joinery, materials, stitching, contributes to the beauty. Every detail mattered to him. So now we're going to talk about Cranbrook. The idea that objects can and should be both useful and beautiful was taking hold in other places as well, including Cranbrook Academy of Art, which is pictured here and located in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. I would encourage all of you to visit if you can. Founded by newspaper magnate George Booth and his wife Ellen Scripps Booth in 1904, it was similar to the Bauhaus in its comprehensive approach to education and design. Students learned several disciplines ranging from weaving to metalwork in order to have a more complete sense of materials and structure. Finnish architect Eliel Saarinen designed the school and the grounds along with his wife and artists Rohe and their children Eero and Pipsen. Eliel also served as its first president and practiced a concept called total design, in which everything from the lighting, the seating, the textiles, masonry, it was all considered together here. So this is pictured here as one of Cranbrook's cafeterias. It's absolutely amazing. But as I mentioned, this was sort of a family affair. Eero was designing chairs, Pipsan was helping as well. The lighting, everything was highly considered. And on the right, we'll be getting into this later, but as I mentioned, Florence will end up there, and this is her pictured with the Saarinen family, including Eero and his parents. So as I just mentioned, Eero worked on some of the lighting and the furniture for the buildings. Loya was a sculptor and a weaver and textile designer, as was Pipson, and an industrial designer. And they did many of the rugs and textiles furniture at Cranbrook. The Saarinens were a very talented family, and this is an image of the dining room at their house at Cranbrook. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Florence now. So Cranbrook is where many of the mid-century modern designers who we're going to talk about today actually met. In fact, it's where Florence, who was orphaned at age 12, began her education. This is Kingswood School for Girls, which is part of Cranbrook. After Florence showed an interest and talent for architecture and design, Eliel Saarinen took a special interest in her. Over time, the Saarinens came to treat her as a member of the family, and she became close friends with Eero. She also got to take really cool vacations with the Saarinen family in the summer to Finland and was introduced to people like Alvar Aalto. This was Florence's world, and in the Cranbrook grounds and buildings, you can see the roots and influence of her signature Knoll look. After graduating from Kingswood, Florence enrolled at Cranbrook Academy of Art and studied architecture. And she went on to study at the Architectural Association in London, but returned to the US in the run-up of World War II. In 1940, she worked as an intern for Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer, influential designers in the Bauhaus. And she completed her formal training at what is now Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago with Mies van Dro. So she worked with all the best. All these Bauhaus greats left an impression on Florence, but her rigorous and methodical approach to design clearly echoes a more Miesian approach. So how that influences her legacy. Florence embraced the creative principles of the Bauhaus, design excellence, technological innovation, and mass production. When Florence joined Knoll founder Hans Knoll at his company, then called H.G. Knoll Associates in 1943, she saw an immediate need there for space planning services and an overall design approach. To address this need, she created the planning unit, which embodied the concept of total design, from the initial plan to the final selection and placement of accessories and art objects. She kind of essentially founded the profession of, I think, space planning and interior design. So in the sense that that was becoming a profession. This was also at a time when industrial design was becoming a profession itself. So she was sort of a pioneer in the sense of offering that as a service to clients. Although small, the planning unit quickly became renowned for revolutionizing the American business environment. Corporate executives with an eye for design took note of its unique, detail-oriented approach. The planning unit represented the synthesis of Hans and Florence Knoll's strengths, her eye for an all-encompassing design experience, and his knack for the marketing of a complete product package. So there's Hans himself. Whether the project is a building or chair or textile, they're each expressions of the same search for harmonious balance between usefulness and beauty. Florence was also known for her ability to sell clients on the Knoll approach. She was one of the first in the industry to use concept or these paste ups, which you see on the left, which were cardboard models that were also affixed with different textile and materials to really show the clients the spaces she envisioned for them. These conveyed the feeling of the space and made executives more comfortable with the new ideas Knoll was proposing. Florence and Hans married in 1946, and she became even more deeply invested in the company. Florence felt the upholstery available on the contract furniture market didn't reflect the quality of Knoll's designs. That led her to establishing Knoll Textiles in 1947. Knoll Textiles collaborated with highly talented designers like Annie Albers, publicly crediting them for their work and forever changing the language of modern textiles. And what you see here is Florence and Hans, but then also some of the ephemera from Knoll Textiles' amazing archive. And then there's Shu, as she was affectionately called. But, you know, she really was doing everything. She was planning the space, but as she says here, if she wasn't able to find or source a piece of furniture for a job, she usually ended up doing it herself. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, Florence Knoll also designed individual pieces of furniture when she couldn't find the pieces she needed for a project. Her designs, which she would call meat and potatoes, which I love, were less sculptural in nature than designs like by Bertoia or Saarinen, but they reflect her architectural training and show a command of the modern aesthetic. When Hans was killed in a car accident in 1955, she began running Knoll Associates for the next 10 years, 5 of which she served as president, and during which the company doubled. During this time, she also acted as design director, recruiting design talent like Eero Saarinen, Alexander Girard, Osamu Noguchi, and others to the Knoll roster, furthering its ascent as a design powerhouse. What Nelson did for Herman Miller, Florence did for Knoll, and she ended up retiring in 1965. But these are some of her designs for Knoll, including the coffee table, sofas, the bench, and a really great desk. So now we're going to talk about a guy named Gilbert Rohde. Florence was not the only one influenced by the Bauhaus ideology and education. A young man named Gilbert Rohde was doing illustrations of furniture for Macy's when he decided to take a tour of Europe in 1927. He went to the Bauhaus in Dessau, Germany, the first American industrial designer to spend any real time there, and saw furniture designed for mass production, including Marcel Breuer's tubular steel collection. What he saw there served as a basis for his own designs, which he used to sell the idea of producing modern furniture to D.J. Dupree, Herman Miller's founder. So Star Furniture Company, which would eventually become Herman Miller, was originally a reproduction furniture company. And in the 1920s, it was making bedroom and dining room suites that were based on 18th and 19th century furniture styles. So what you see here, fake antiques in a way. Rohde convinced D.J. Dupree that making reproductions was fundamentally a dishonest business, pointing to the faux antique finishes that were decorative elements that usually were done to hide poor craftsmanship and joinery. And he explained that the lifestyle of the middle class was changing and that they needed furniture that could meet their new needs. Dupree agreed and took a chance on Rohde and brought him on as design director. Rohde was also a great marketer and was able to explain modernism in more layman's terms. He wrote the first American trade catalog devoted entirely to modern furniture design, but it kind of looked more like a magazine. And he used that introduction to explain the logic of modern design to new clients. So jumping back to Cranbrook, at about the same time that Rohde was convincing Dupree to make modern furniture, Cranbrook was entering kind of a golden age because of the incredible talent the school attracted and nurtured. So Florence Schust, Eero Saarinen, Ray and Charles Eames, and Harry Bertoia were all coming to Cranbrook and learning and making in that community at this time. So here you see Charles Eames working in one of his studios at Cranbrook. Cranbrook expected students to work across several areas like metalsmithing, ceramics, and industrial design, rather than focusing on developing expertise for only one. A good example of obviously a very cool person who was at Cranbrook was at the time Ray Kaiser, who came to Cranbrook having already studied abstract expressionist painting under Hans Hofmann. She's a founding member of the Abstract Expressionist Group of America, was also taking dance classes with Martha Graham in New York City. And she, when she came to Cranbrook, ended up working in textiles and industrial design, kind of honing her own total design skills. She and Charles, of course, pursued many creative ventures over their lifetimes, including furniture design, films, toys, and exhibit design. This is kind of fun. Their friend, fine artist, and metalsmith Harry Bertoia didn't have much metal to work with at Cranbrook because of war-related shortages, but he ended up designing jewelry, including the Eames's wedding rings, which are pictured here. Bertoia would go on to work with the Eames office, experimenting with bending and welding wire. Eventually, feeling the work he was doing with the Eames wasn't getting the recognition he deserved, he went out on his own. So by that time, Florence, who he knew from his Cranbrook days, was at Knoll. Florence and Hans offered Knoll his own metal shop in a corner of Knoll's production facility. After Bertoia delayed in accepting, Florence lobbied Bertoia's wife, Birgitta, and who ultimately accepted the offer on his behalf. Florence was sure that he would produce something extraordinary if given time and space to experiment. So she and Hans never demanded that he design furniture. Instead, they encouraged him to explore whatever he liked and share with them should he arrive at something interesting. The result was this now iconic Bertoia collection, introduced in 1952, which has become pretty iconic and recognized worldwide as one of the greatest achievements of 20th century furniture. Bertoia described the design as mainly made of air, like sculpture. So some more contemporary photography of that line today, which is still in production. I like this quote from Knoll historian Brian Lutz, who also did a book, but Bertoia's paintings were better than his sculptures, and his sculptures were better than his furniture, and his furniture was absolutely brilliant. So now, Eames and Saarinen and molded plywood. So working in a variety of media, the way Bertoia did was typical for the crowd at Cranbrook, where experimentation and design with new materials was encouraged. Eero and Charles were especially interested in bending and molding plywood, which later led to their experiments with other materials, including fiberglass and wire. They were equally interested in creating chairs that were comfortable. I think you could say that their efforts during this time were sort of the root of ergonomic design for Herman Miller and Knoll and many other companies as well. So in 1941, Charles and Eero, along with other students, including Rohe, collaborated on furniture designs for MoMA's Organic Design and Home Furnishings competition. These molded chair designs are definitely the seeds for many of the products both Herman Miller and Knoll would come to be known for. To me, I think you can see the beginnings of ideas around the womb chair and the Eames's molded fiberglass chairs. So Saarinen originally wanted to be a sculptor, and that sculptor sensibility comes through in a lot of his designs, including the womb chair on the left. On the right is the Eames shell chair, which also has its roots in those designs from the competition. The designers took what they learned from the early designs they did together and went in different directions. So after that MoMA competition, obviously they went their separate ways. After their respective collaborations, or as their respective collaborations with Herman Miller and Knoll flourished, Charles and Eero remained good friends who admired and informed each other's work. This is actually a picture of the womb chair in the Eames house early after they moved in, and it predates their own molded lounge chair, the 670, by a few years. So even as they worked for competing companies, they still appreciated the designs each other were creating. They also informed each other's work and drove each other creatively. Charles said that, quote, Eero had a very competitive nature and would call me very early in the morning, his time, and start to describe an idea for a chair. This was his general spirit of staking a claim. Eero was in Detroit while the Eameses had moved to California, so he was probably calling Charles at like 3 a.m. Another fun story is told by Charles. He said, quote, there was a situation in which Eero had a full-size drawing on the back of a door, and he gave me a split-second view of it. It was in the dark, and he turned the light on and off, pop, pop. Then he asked me to describe the whole situation. As far as he was concerned, that 10th of a second view was all you needed. So there were definitely times when the designers were showing each other what they were working on for other companies, and also probably lending opinions here and there on how to do things differently. Here's a quote from Saarinen referencing his pedestal collection for Knoll. Quote, I've been working evenings and have a whole wall full of sketches. I have come up with an idea that I think will wipe Herman Miller off the map. According to a curator at Cranbrook, Eero had gotten wind that George Nelson was working on a similar one-legged chair for Florence, wanting to be first to the market, rushed prototypes to New York, and launched the chair with only prototypes in May 1958 and said coming February 1959. George immediately sent a telegram to Eero that said, you win. So Eero beat him to the market. This is Eero and his wife, Eliel, sitting at a pedestal table in their Victorian home on the Cranbrook campus with their son, who was also named Eames after Charles. So they really were friends and close with one another. So now to George Nelson. Nelson, pictured here, was another central figure in the early days of modernism in America. He became Herman Miller's design director in 1945 after Gilbert Rohde died suddenly. Nelson, at the time, was an odd choice because he knew really nothing about the furniture industry. He was an architect and writer for Time, an architectural forum. But DJ Dupree had read Nelson's article about the storage wall, which is pictured here, that he had developed with another architect. And it was designed to replace a home's non-load-bearing wall. The storage wall was composed of partitions created of interchangeable, prefabricated modular storage units that would hold all the consumer goods post-war Americans could want. Built-in furniture wasn't a wholly new idea, but the storage wall was the best execution of it yet. And Nelson had written a compelling case for it. Dupree's assessment of Nelson was that he was, quote, a keen student of living and home life in all its phases. The fact that he had no experience in the furniture industry didn't bother Dupree at all. So there's Nelson again, one of his quotes. Nelson went on to design things that are probably very recognizable to you all, including the platform bench, the coconut chair, the marshmallow sofa, basic cabinet series. Nelson also had an office full of many talented designers, including people like Irving Harper and Lucia de Respinis, and designers who would go on to have their own very illustrious careers. So just giving credit to the many people who worked on these designs. Nelson was pivotal not only because of his designs, but because of the design talent he managed to recruit. When the Eameses exhibited their molded plywood chair, Nelson took Dupree to see it. This was at the MoMA, and the company moved quickly to secure the chair to make part of the line. There are telegrams actually in the Herman Miller archives showing that Hans Knoll also very much wanted to carry the chair. Saarinen was already working with Knoll, so it would have made sense in a way for the Eameses to join them, but ultimately the Eameses chose Herman Miller, thinking it was a better fit. Maybe somewhat apocryphal story, but also been noted that Charles really liked the pastries in Zeeland, Michigan, where Herman Miller was headquartered, so perhaps that's why he chose. There's also Frank's, which has great hamburgers, which I know he liked to go there as well. Nelson, kind of like Rohde and following his lead, also excelled at marketing and came up with this concept for Herman Miller's 1948 collection catalog that really reads more like a book about design. He, like Rohde, wanted to explain the concepts and purposes behind his approach to modernism, but from a production quality standpoint, also wanted to make the catalog a lot nicer with expensive paper and biographies of the major designers that were included. So this concept of author design being a thing that he's kind of introducing and promoting. The projected cost to produce this catalog initially was, from Dupree's perspective, prohibitive. But rather than backing off, Nelson doubled down. He proposed a cloth-bound hardcover with a dust jacket, and then he proposed charging money for it, which no one had done in the furniture industry before. But the risk paid off. People bought it, and demand was so great that the catalog was reprinted in 1950, with other editions coming later in 1952. So now Girard. Alexander Girard didn't go to Cranbrook, but he did have a design shop during Cranbrook's golden age in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, which was not far from the school. He briefly designed textiles for Knoll, and he designed the uniquely shaped Model 108 coffee table pictured here on the right for Knoll in 1948. Girard's shop also carried Eames furniture early on, so he was definitely in the mix. When George Nelson and Ray and Charles Eames couldn't find the textiles they liked for their designs, Nelson ended up recruiting him to lead the fabric and textiles division at Herman Miller, which was founded in 1951. Nelson also brought on Isamu Noguchi, who designed the iconic coffee table that you see here for Herman Miller. And in 1955, Noguchi was designing for Knoll as well, the cyclone table that you see here. So it's interesting to see talent working and moving between both companies. So 2 companies, 2 approaches to design. Eero Saarinen and the Eameses had a bit of different approaches to design, and those approaches helped mold both Knoll and Herman Miller. The Eameses were very systematic, using a sort of kit of parts. If you look at their pieces, it's about how they come together and how you can do that over and over and over again. All of their furniture was highly engineered as well as beautiful. Their motto was to make the best for the most for the least. And as Ray said, what works good is better than what looks good, because what works good lasts. I love that quote. It was the same functional approach that the Bauhaus championed. As you saw from the exploded view of the Eames lounge chair on the last side, Charles was all about the connections. This is one of his famous quotes. But again, you look at Eames furniture and it's about where the legs meet the base of the chair, the shock mounts. Again, I'll flash this up on the screen again, but it's really about how all of these pieces come together to make something beautiful, but also how you can do that not just once, but a million times. Saarinen's approach, on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, was a bit more evocative of sculpture. Eero had initially wanted to be a sculptor like his mother, and that artistic sensibility is evident in the womb chair and the tulip chair and table. Just a quick aside about the womb chair. Saarinen designed the womb chair, but Florence was the design director at the time and briefed the project. Florence said, quote, "I told Eero I was sick and tired of the one-dimensional lounge chair that's long and narrow. I said I want a chair I can sit in sideways or any other way I want to sit in it." Saarinen designed and modeled 3 chairs to show to her. Each was a different size of chair, and he suggested Knoll make the smallest of the designs because it would be the most marketable. But she chose the largest because she had said at one point she wanted it to feel like a basket full of pillows. You can also see the difference between Eero and Eames, not just in their furniture design, but also how they practice architecture. The Eames house, which you see here on the left, looks like something you could create using materials from a home improvement store right off the shelf, which is super cool and accessible. The Eameses used a more industrial approach and industrial looking materials to build this very perfect box in the Pacific Palisades. But the TWA terminal designed by Saarinen, which you see on the right here, is quite literally like being inside a piece of sculpture. The companies also took different approaches to planning in a way. Florence has this quote, "I saw the development of furniture in the sense of a need for a total job. Charles Eames and George Nelson saw it in the sense of an individual piece." And I think what she means there is when she was approaching furniture design, it was usually in service of a job, a very specific job that she was working on, whereas Nelson and Eames and even Saarinen were kind of focusing more on the furniture itself. The work of the Knoll Planning Unit continued to follow Florence's total design approach. She considered everything from the wall colors to the pieces of furniture itself, just like the Saarinens did in their design of Cranbrook. Also, just to say, these were planning unit projects, Connecticut General Life, and Milliken. Herman Miller and designer / inventor Robert Probst took a systems-based approach. Instead, white-collar work was emerging, and Nelson and Probst saw that offices were unsuited to contemporary office worker needs. So like those needs being things like storing paper and collaborating on work together. So with Action Office 1, which you see here on the left, they designed furniture to try to solve this problem. And it was beautiful and celebrated in the industry, but it was a commercial failure and didn't sell very well. So Probst started talking to behavioral scientists to better understand the cognitive processes knowledge workers used. He then kind of furthered ideas from Action Office 1 with Action Office 2, which had parts that could be configured for any floor plate or client. Knoll, on the other hand, not only considered how people interacted with the furniture, but also how the furniture interacted with the space and architecture around it. So selling modern. While their approaches to design differed, when it came to educating people about modernism, Herman Miller and Knoll were similar. To sell the furniture they were making, both companies had to help the buying public accept these pieces that were pretty radical looking at the time. There are anecdotes about how people, when they first saw the plywood chair, weren't sure if it would even support them, let alone be comfortable. And the Gucci table didn't look like anything people really had ever seen before. Florence Knoll and George Nelson both created vignettes in their respective companies' showrooms rather than just displaying individual pieces of furniture. This served as inspiration, showing people how modern furniture could work in their homes and workplaces. So not only were they inventive of the processes, materials, and designs, but they were also inventive in the ways to sell them. The companies took a similar approach to advertising. On the left, you have an ad by Herbert Matter, which is a more abstract approach, but you also see the variety of colors, materials, and finishes, and even the variety of table heights. The ad on the right was designed by Irving Harper for the George Nelson office, and he too is showing the breadth and depth of the Eames line and showing how many options there are. So both companies had a hand in inventing the modern office and in shifting the tastes and preferences of the buying public. And that was in large part due to their key designers. So modernism made in America. Quote from Peter Blake, he was an architect and renowned design critic, but he says here, just as the abstract expressionists moved the center of gravity of modern art from Paris to New York, so Eero Saarinen and Charles Eames at almost the same moment shifted the center of gravity of modern design from Western Europe to North America. So that also may have been influenced by World War II and a lot of people having to leave Europe to be safe, like people moving from the Bauhaus to Chicago. But North America at this time at mid-century was really where these ideas started to catch on and flourish in a more mass sense, which then would go on to happen in Europe as well. So that's the end. We've just scratched the surface of these designers, and if you want to know more, we have some more CEUs about individual designers, and we encourage you to take those classes as well. I can't read this slide from here, but it's done.
Yeah. Well done, Amy. I see lots of hearts and lots of clapping and thumbs up in the chat. Yeah, amazing job. So we do have time, everyone, for some Q&A. So please enter your questions in the chat field, and I'll give those to Amy.
Hopefully I can answer them.
Right. So you've got a lot of inspiring, thank you, great presentation, hands up. So no questions yet, but it's all kudos that are flowing in.
Covered it all. I see Lisa made it. Thanks for coming, Lisa.
Yes. So Amy is referring to Lisa Demetrius, who is joining us from California, and she is the granddaughter of Charles and Ray Eames and the chief curator at the Eames Institute.
No
so
pressure.
Thank you for joining us. Sounds very illustrious, right? Okay.
Yeah, everyone check out the Eames Institute. They have amazing online exhibits delving more deeply into many of the design stories that I told here today. So eamesinstitute.org.
Yeah. Okay, so I see a question here. I'll start with this one. How does MillerKnoll get their talented designers today?
We have very talented product and creative teams who are, I think, using this amazing design DNA that we have to really look forward and kind of identify who are the new Eames, Florence Knoll, Eero Saarinens of today.
Yeah, yeah. And I would say we have, there are some designers in our network. And if you think about it, it's a pretty broad network because it includes Herman Miller, it includes Knoll, it includes Holly Hunt, it includes, Hay, so on and so forth. So there's a network of designers that we've had ongoing relationships with, right? That have been designing products for us for a number of years, but we're always looking for new design talent, which is really fun. So I think that we have our own R&D group internally, but that network of external designers paired with our own research is really something that we focus on. Okay, so let me look at chat. Okay, somebody says they can tell where you are based on your background, Amy. She's at Modernism Week in Palm Springs. So, oh, okay. Here's a question for that I believe is geared towards Lisa Demetrius, and it is when will the Eames Institute open to the public? And I'm going to say a couple of things. First, Lisa, if you want to take yourself off mute and answer that question, but this is a nice segue because for the March design perspectives, Lisa Demetrius is joining us, and she's going to be sharing a presentation on the work and design process of Charles and Ray Eames and the way they live. So we'll get a lot more information. So look for those invitations. But Lisa, if you want to take yourself off of mute, if possible. She may not be able to because she's on as a guest. So I guess we'll just have to hear more from Lisa. March 16th is actually the date. Okay.
I think I'm unmuted. Would you like
you're
me?
unmuted.
Hello?
Okay.
Hi, thank you.
Hi, Lisa. When is the
hi.
Institute opening? Maybe you want to give a little commercial on what is the Eames Institute exactly.
Well, first of all, Amy, you did a wonderful job. You brought back some great memories, and I love the visuals you shared along with the stories. It's such an amazing story of the Bauhaus to Kramberg to Miller and Knoll now today. And it's just so exciting to see this new chapter in this incredible legacy that began, I feel, in Europe and was brought over, as you said, to the United States. And I think we're still applying some of those ideas today. So hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Demetrius, Chief Curator at the Eames Institute of Infinite Curiosity. I am talking to you from the Eames Ranch in Petaluma, California, which is the current home for the Eames Institute. We've just begun a renovation for 2 years. We're going to be off the grid here at this location in a few years, so we're beginning those steps. We are planning to continue to do pop-ups that people can visit in person, as well as create a space over in the East Bay in Oakland, Richmond, where we are going to be able to welcome and have guests come and see the archival material that we are inventorying and cataloging right now. So some exciting next steps. And as was suggested, if you visit eamesinstitute.org, that's where we're sharing updates as things begin to open in different ways and in different locations. That's the quick version.
Okay, well, thank you, Lisa. And we'll have the extended version, again, March 16th on MillerKnoll Design Perspectives. So thank you, Lisa, for joining this presentation. And we look forward to hearing more next month. So I'm going to move on to another question for Amy. So Amy, in your opinion, is there a singular piece of furniture you feel represents the modernist movement as a whole?
Oh,
hard to choose one, right?
I mean, everything we just saw. I don't know that you can pick just one, because I think there were a lot of materials that were being used. I mean, I guess you could start with Breuer trying to bend tubular steel and plywood being bent and molded every which way. So I don't know that I would be able to pick just one, but I really like Eames lounge chairs and Barcelona chairs and room chairs. So we're kind of lucky that we have all of these iconic pieces that really represent risk taking and new ideas and material exploration.
Sort of like, which child do you love the most, right? It's a difficult question to answer. Here's one, Amy. I don't know the answer. Hopefully you do, but are there any official MillerKnoll tours at Cranbrook? Or would this simply be done through Cranbrook directly?
I would encourage everyone. Cranbrook has an amazing storage, like collection storage tour that you're able to access via their website, where you can see, again, a lot of the pieces that we were just talking about. Also, the campus is roamable, and you can kind of see a lot of the spaces that I was talking about today. But also, I know, I don't know of anything officially yet, but they tend to open up when organizations like Docomomo or Michigan Modern will arrange sort of campus days where you can visit. So I would just encourage people to pay attention to the Cranbrook Art Museum's website.
So here's another question similar to the last one, Amy. What's your holy grail item in the Herman Miller collection you don't have yet? So I think this is more of a personal collection. Is there something you're coveting, or and I think that could be taken as maybe it's an archival piece, right? That is no longer in production, or it could be something in production that you're eyeing.
I mean, I think it's going to be really cool looking at today, making the work of Nick Cave part of the Knoll Textiles archive. I mean, obviously that then is in a lineage of people like Sheila Hicks and Annie Albers. So, I mean, our job in the archives is ongoing and collecting for today. So it's really amazing to be able to continue to add. Nick Cave was also a Cranbrook student, so the legacy continues. I personally am a huge Isamu Noguchi fan, and so as we've been working to catalog Knoll's archive, which Knoll has an amazing corporate archive as well, we have come across a lamp that Noguchi designed for Knoll that was for sale for a brief amount of time, which was a personal holy grail. But any of Noguchi's designs for Herman Miller outside of the coffee table, he had some marble topped tables that he did that were also briefly for sale, and there aren't that many of them. So I'm always keeping my eyes peeled and hoping I find some in a basement.
Yeah, exactly. Quickly, before we go on to the next question, Amy mentioned Nick Cave, who studied at Cranbrook, an amazing artist. I suggest you Google him. He just completed an amazing installation at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and it is moved to the Guggenheim Museum in New York. So if you're in New York, you should look for that. But we're currently collaborating with Nick Cave on a textile collection for Knoll Textiles. So look for that coming soon. The next question, this is an interesting one about materiality, Amy. Was plywood used because of the lack of materials after the war, meaning World War II? How did the lack of materials post-World War II help to define Herman Miller and Knoll furniture?
Well, I think, molding plywood wasn't wholly new. You had like other manufacturers like Tone, or you had Alvar Aalto who was doing it and bending it in a two-dimensional way. And so I think that material itself was already very interesting to designers at the time. But Ray and Charles Eames actually, though, did not have access to plywood during the war, and they sort of got around that or worked through that by taking on a commission with the Navy. You know, they wanted to help with the war effort, but in a way that wasn't harmful and more helpful. So they were able to sort of perfect the 3D molded plywood process through working on the splints, which you may have seen that have now become like covetable pieces of sculpture in and of themselves. But I think working on that project gave them access to using plywood, as well as Charles working at, you know, MGM on film sets, and then was able to kind of come to fruition after the war once the supplies weren't running so low, and they were able to take those ideas back to manufacturing furniture.
Here's an interesting question. How does the original founding design philosophy carry through into current product development? 21st century, right?
I mean, in my opinion, or as I said earlier, like we have this incredible design DNA that is rooted in risk taking and developing new talent and trying new things and making things that nobody has ever seen before and kind of shifting people's ideas of what is beautiful. I think when the womb chair came out, or when the Noguchi table came out, or when the Eames molded plywood furniture came out, that was pretty wild looking to people at the time. And so I think that those ideas, or that spirit, is very much where we are lucky to jump off from today and kind of use that for what's next.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of materiality risk taking, right? And then the other thing is original design. So whether it's coming out of Herman Miller or Hay or Knoll, unlike some other manufacturers, it's not going to be copying something someone else tried to do. You know, it's all original design.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we've focused on Herman Miller and Knoll today, but I think you can look at anyone in the collective of brands, and they're all working from the same shared idea of risk-taking, authored design, and working with new ideas and materials.
Yep. So our next question, clearly these subjects were innovators in architecture and design. Was there a tenor in the industry at the time that indicated just how much of an impact they would have on design?
Read that again to me.
Yes.
Sorry.
So clearly these subjects were innovators in architecture and design.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a tenor in the industry at the time that indicated just how much of an impact they would have on design? So my interpretation of that question would be, at the time that, they're innovating, they're coming up with breakthrough things. Did they have any idea, or did the people around them have any idea the permanence of some of these design solutions that they were developing?
I mean, I think they had hope that they would be the sort of ubiquitous icons that they've become. But I think at the time, people like the Eameses and Saarinen were like celebrities in the industry. And I think the architect in industry was this idea that was emerging that was also getting a lot of press at the time. So I think these ideas and these products maybe were at first receiving a lot of attention because they were maybe shocking and new. But yeah, I mean, I think, they were famous and popular when they were hitting the market, and then obviously have developed into, something like the pedestal series or the Eames molded fiberglass, where now you're used to seeing it in a way.
Mm-hmm.
It's like what you expect almost a chair to look like, versus then it was radical.
Yeah, yeah. And Amy, you know this better than anyone, but I would venture to say that there are certain pieces, many of which we saw in this presentation, that were designed in the 20th century that have this design permanence. But there were a number of other products that were developed and designed then that maybe did not. And it all has to do with that risk taking. So, you know, not everything is going to always be an immediate or long-term commercial success. Okay, what advice would you give to aspiring designers in high school?
Oh, well, read a lot of books and do
Uh-huh.
research and get a good baseline of how the profession of design has developed. So yeah, read a lot of books and
Yeah.
that might sound boring, but it's essential.
Scrolling, there are some questions about CEU certification, which Evelyn has answered. Oh, here's an interesting one, which I would say connects back to Michigan. Was there interaction between modern furniture design and automobile design? For instance, the introduction of bucket seats in cars instead of bench seating.
Um, I I think biggest connection that I know of based on what we spoke about today was the Saarinen designed GM campus that a lot of this furniture was being spec'd for at the time, but also Saarinen sort of carrying through his design approach to a space that would house um, automobile designers. But yeah.
Yep. Here's an interesting one. How do you think the modernism movement was directly influenced by historic events happening around the same time?
I mean, I think World War II had a lot to do with it, where
Yeah.
you have, as I mentioned, great designers who were working in Europe being forced to decamp to the States and kind of developing um, designers here and having a great influence, but also, as we mentioned, materials being available or not available and manufacturing processes that were developed or materials like fiberglass that were developed for war purposes then being repurposed into furniture and consumer goods. So definitely, I mean, unfortunately, war being a vehicle for product design.
Um, Amy, what do you think Florence Knoll would think about Herman Miller's recent acquisition of Knoll?
I can't say. I mean, I'm sure, for me as a design historian in a way, like the fact that these companies are now one is, not anything I would have ever predicted. But I think as we saw here today in the presentation, there's a lot of shared DNA and a lot of shared ideas around how to get design done. But I can't say. I mean, she'd probably find it interesting, as would the Eameses, as would Saarinen. So yeah, non-answer answer.
Here's a comment. Yeah, Nick Cave, he's amazing. Okay. Amy Auscherman, what are you most looking forward to learning more about in the future?
Knoll and all of the amazing brands that are part of the Knoll universe. Obviously, as I said, consider myself in a way a design historian. So Knoll was already, I was a brand fan. I was a Florence Knoll fan. So just learning more about the company through its amazing archive and the people.
Well, I think I'm looking at the chat. There are many more kudos and thanks. And we've got perfect timing because we hit all of our questions and we are just a few seconds from the top of the hour. So thank you, Amy. This was amazing and insightful. I would thank the audience for attending, and again, in March, the MillerKnoll Design Perspectives will be March 16th, noon Eastern time, and we will have Lisa Demetrius, who is the chief curator of the Eames Institute, granddaughter of Charles and Ray Eames, to share more. Also, I just saw a question about the QR code. There we go. There we go. So, all right. Thank you, everyone, again for joining us, and we will see you March 16th at our next Design Perspectives. Thank you.
Thanks.